At 81, Diana Ross finally tells the truth about Michael Jackson. For over 50 years, Diana Ross watched Michael Jackson become the biggest star on the planet. She mentored him as a child. She believed in him when the world was cruel. But there's something she's never said publicly. Something that happened behind closed doors. Something that changed everything she thought she knew about the boy she helped create. Now, at 81, she's finally breaking her silence. But will the truth set him free? Or destroy his legacy? Diana Ross was already a superstar when the Jackson 5 exploded onto the scene in 1969. She had everything: fame, respect, and the kind of power that only comes from truly changing music forever. But when she met Michael Jackson, something shifted. He wasn't like other child stars. He was 8 years old, already performing with his brothers, but there was something different about him. A vulnerability, a depth that made people stop and listen. Diana saw it immediately. He was extraordinary, she would later say. And she meant it in a way that went beyond his talent. She saw a child who was being pushed, controlled, and shaped by forces around him. A boy who didn't really get to be a boy. This is where their story really begins. Not as performers on the same stage, but as two people connected by something invisible. Diana became more than a mentor. In many ways, she became the voice he couldn't find for himself. She introduced him to people who mattered. She guided his artistic choices. She watched him make decisions that would have crushed most people. And she never told anyone what she saw behind closed doors. Not his family. Not his friends. Not the media that was obsessed with every move he made. For over 50 years, Diana Ross carried this knowledge alone. She watched Michael become the king of pop. She watched his struggles. She watched his triumphs. She watched the world judge him without knowing the full story. But secrets have weight. And after 8 decades of life, Diana Ross decided that the weight was no longer worth carrying. The truth she's been holding could change everything we think we know about Michael Jackson. It's not about scandal. It's about survival. The early 1970s were chaotic for Michael Jackson. His father, Joe Jackson, was relentless. Every rehearsal was brutal. Every performance had to be flawless. There was no room for mistakes, no room for childhood, no room for being anything less than extraordinary. Diana Ross saw all of this. She was around the Jackson family during this period, and what she witnessed disturbed her in ways she couldn't fully express at the time. Michael was being molded, not guided. Molded, like clay being shaped by hands that didn't care if the clay was comfortable with the process. He would come to me with questions, Diana would later describe. Not about how to sing better. Not about how to dance better. Questions about whether he was good enough. Whether people actually loved him, or just loved what he could do for them. These are the questions a child should never have to ask. Diana began to understand something crucial that most people missed. Michael Jackson's genius wasn't just his talent. It was his ability to survive. To keep moving forward even when everything around him was designed to break him. She watched him internalize a message that would haunt him forever, that his worth was directly connected to his performance. That love was conditional. That rest was weakness. Diana didn't just see the superstar in training. She saw a boy who was slowly learning to disappear. And so she made a choice. She became his refuge. When Michael needed someone to talk to, Diana was there. When he needed someone to believe him, she believed him. When he needed someone to remind him that he was more than his talent, she tried. She tried so hard. But there was a limit to what even Diana Ross could do. The machinery was too big. The pressure was too intense. The expectation was too enormous. What Diana witnessed during those formative years shaped everything she would later know about Michael Jackson. It wasn't something she could just forget or ignore. It became the foundation for everything else that would happen in his life. And it's the key to understanding the real Michael Jackson. Not the headlines. Not the scandals. Not the public persona. But the person underneath. The one that only a few people ever truly knew. Diana Ross was one of those few people. By the mid-1970s, Michael Jackson was a teenager stuck between two worlds. He was no longer a child performer. But he wasn't quite an adult either. The Jackson 5 were still huge, but Michael's solo career was starting to emerge. There was a crossroads coming. Diana Ross was there when it happened. Michael had to choose. Continue as part of the family group or strike out on his own. Seem loyal or seem ambitious. Stay safe or risk everything. Most teenagers would have considered their own happiness in this equation. Michael didn't. Not really. He chose what he thought he had to choose. Diana would later reflect. Not what would make him happy, but what he thought would make him valuable. This was the moment Diana saw it clearly. The pattern that would define Michael Jackson's entire life was already set. He had learned that his worth came from his work. That love was performance. That safety came from being indispensable. And he had learned it so young that he didn't even realize he was carrying it. Diana tried to talk to him about this. She told him that he deserved more than just achievement. That happiness mattered. That being human mattered more than being perfect. But the message didn't land. Not because Michael didn't respect Diana. He did. Deeply. But because the foundation had already been poured. By his family. By the industry. By a world that loved him for what he could do, not for who he was. Diana watched him pour everything into his work. Watched him become isolated. Watched him build walls so high that eventually, even his closest friends couldn't reach him. I tried, she would say years later. But you can't save someone who doesn't believe they deserve saving. This is what Diana has been carrying all these years. Not a scandal. Not a secret affair. But the knowledge that she saw the machinery destroying a child, and she was powerless to stop it completely. She could offer guidance. She could offer love. She could offer wisdom. But she couldn't rewrite his childhood. She couldn't undo what was already done. And the hardest part? Michael knew she was right. He knew what she was saying was true. But by then, his entire identity was built on the opposite belief. That's what Diana has finally decided to tell. Diana Ross has decided to reveal specific moments that have never been made public. Conversations, decisions, vulnerabilities that Michael trusted only her with. One of the most significant, Michael's relationship with his own identity. He didn't know who he was, Diana explains. He had been Michael Jackson the performer since he was a toddler. But Michael Jackson the person? That person was a stranger to him. This wasn't depression talking. This wasn't melodrama. This was clinical reality. Michael had spent so much time becoming perfect that he had never developed a self outside of performance. Diana watched him struggle with basic human connections. She saw him try to build relationships, only to pull away when people got too close. He was terrified that they would discover who he really was underneath the celebrity and be disappointed. He would ask me, "Do you think anyone could ever love me if I wasn't famous?" And the question broke my heart because he was completely serious. He genuinely didn't know the answer. There's more. Diana witnessed Michael making choices that seemed strange to the public, but made complete sense to her. His appearance changes. His social withdrawal. His obsession with control in the studio. These weren't random behaviors. They were symptoms of someone trying to escape from themselves. He was constantly reinventing, Diana says. Not because he wanted to grow artistically, but because he was running from who he thought he was supposed to be. He wanted to shed that skin and become someone new. Someone who didn't carry all that weight. Diana also holds information about Michael's relationships with the people closest to him. His family. His friends. His romantic interests. She watched him sabotage connections because he genuinely believed he didn't deserve happiness. If someone got too close, he would push them away. Not out of cruelty. Out of self-preservation. He thought, if I let them know the real me, they'll leave anyway. So I'll leave first. This pattern became more pronounced as Michael aged. The lonelier he became, the more he retreated. The more he retreated, the more the world misunderstood him. The more misunderstood he felt, the harder he worked to prove his worth through performance. It was a cycle. An endless cycle that Diana watched unfold for decades. And what she's finally realized, what she wants to tell now, is that understanding this cycle changes everything about how we see Michael Jackson's entire life. His choices, his struggles, his pain. It reframes him from a broken superstar into something else entirely. Diana Ross has never been one to shy away from speaking her mind. She's a legend. She's powerful. She's someone who fought for herself and refused to be diminished. But with Michael Jackson, she made a different choice. I promised him, she says simply. I promised him that what he told me would stay between us. And a promise to Michael was sacred. But keeping that promise came at a cost. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, as Michael's life became increasingly complicated, Diana watched from the sidelines. She saw the allegations. She saw the controversy. She saw people attack him viciously, often without knowing the full story. And she couldn't defend him publicly without breaking his confidence. It was torture, Diana admits. I wanted to scream at the world. I wanted to tell them, you don't understand who he is. You don't know what happened to him. You're being cruel to someone who is already broken. But she stayed silent. This silence wasn't passive. It was active. It required Diana to sit through interviews without correcting misconceptions. It required her to listen to people judge Michael when she knew things they didn't. It required her to bite her tongue while the narrative about him became increasingly distorted. And it changed her. I became angry, Diana reflects. Not at Michael, at the situation, at myself for not being able to help more, at a world that was destroying someone I loved. Diana began to understand Michael's isolation in a deeply personal way. She was isolated too, isolated by knowledge she couldn't share, isolated by a promise she refused to break, isolated by the weight of watching someone suffer and being unable to publicly acknowledge it. She watched his behavior become more erratic. She watched his relationships crumble. She watched him retreat further into Neverland, building a world where he could control everything because the real world had never given him control over anything. And still, Diana said nothing. Years passed. Decades passed. Diana aged. Michael continued to struggle. And the distance between them grew, not because they stopped caring, but because the secret between them became too heavy for either of them to properly navigate. I wonder sometimes, Diana says, her voice breaking slightly, if I made the right choice. If my silence actually helped him, or if it hurt him. If there was something I could have done differently. This question has haunted her for years. And it's the reason she's finally breaking that silence now. Diana Ross didn't decide to tell the story because she wanted attention. She didn't do it for headlines or to seem relevant. She did it because she finally understood something crucial. Her silence was protecting the wrong narrative. For decades, I thought I was protecting Michael by staying quiet, Diana explains. But I realized I was actually protecting the lie. I was protecting the myth that he was just this mysterious, strange figure. When the real story, the true story, is so much more human, so much more understandable. The truth that Diana has been carrying isn't scandalous. It's tragic. And it's beautiful. It's the story of a child who learned to disappear inside his own talent. A boy who never got to find out who he could have been if he'd been allowed to simply be. Michael wasn't broken because he was weird, Diana says. He was struggling because he was human. And nobody around him, including me for a long time, knew how to help him with that. Now that Michael is gone, Diana has realized that keeping silent isn't loyalty anymore. It's complicity in the misunderstanding that defined his life. I want people to know that the person I knew was fighting so hard to be seen. Not as a performer, but as a person. And nobody heard him. This is what Diana wants the world to understand. Michael Jackson's entire life makes sense when you understand that he was never allowed to develop a self. He was shaped into a perfect machine, and then the world judged him for being mechanical. If people understood that, Diana says, they might have more compassion. They might understand that his struggles weren't character flaws. They were survival responses to an impossible situation. Diana has also spent years thinking about what she would tell Michael if she could talk to him today. I would tell him that he was enough, she says quietly. Just as he was. Even without the talent. Even without the fame. Even without the perfection. He was worthy of love exactly as he was. This is her message now. Not just to Michael's memory, but to anyone who feels trapped in the same cycle. Anyone who has learned that their worth comes from their work. Anyone who doesn't know how to exist without achieving. That's why I'm telling this now, Diana explains. Because Michael's story matters. Not as a celebrity tragedy, but as a human warning. As a reminder that we have to do better by our children. We have to teach them that they're enough before we teach them how to be perfect. At 81, Diana Ross has decided that the truth matters more than the promise. And maybe that's the real wisdom here. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is break a silence that was never meant to last forever. What do you think Diana should have done differently? Was her silence an act of love, or a lost opportunity to help Michael when he needed it most? Comment below and share your thoughts.